This episode of The Trail Went Cold is brought to you by Care of, a monthly subscription vitamin service that delivers completely personalized vitamin and supplement packs right to your door. For 25% off your first month of personalized Care of vitamins, visit takecareof.com and enter the promo code COLD. That's takecareof.com, and the promo code is COLD. Thank you, and enjoy the show. Hello everyone, and welcome to the very first Q&A episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and I hope that everyone had a very happy holidays. The date of this episode's release is December the 26th, aka Boxing Day, and to close off 2018, I thought it would be a good opportunity to do an episode where I answered questions which were sent in by you, the listeners. So I guess technically this will be my first ever episode where the trail didn't go cold, because I'm going to answer all sorts of questions today. And there are a lot of them to get through, so without any further ado, let's get started. So I guess I'll start things off by answering the one question I got asked more than any other, and it's pretty much a variation on the question, what case which you've covered on the podcast would you most like to see solved more than any other? Some of the listeners who sent in this question included Julie, Anya, and Andrew, so thank you very much to everyone. Now, this is a tough question to answer, and depending on which day you asked me, I would probably give different answers. But there are three cases which really stick out, and I should divide them up into categories. The first one is the Tommy Ziegler case, aka the Winter Garden Furniture Store murders, which from a legal standpoint is technically solved, but it's my number one case where I would most like to know the full truth about what happened. It's such a massive rabbit hole, and I definitely lean towards Tommy being innocent and having been wrongly convicted, so the best case scenario is that he would get fully exonerated and released from prison. But I've always had the mindset that even if he was guilty, there's no way this crime took place like the prosecution presented at trial. There are just way too many holes in it. And while I have a pretty good idea who masterminded these murders, whether Tommy was innocent or guilty, this case is still a massive jigsaw puzzle, and I still can't figure out how all the pieces fit together. So if there was one crime where I'd like to follow all the events from A to Z and see exactly what happened, it would be this one. And I guess my other two choices would be the very first two cases that I covered on the podcast, the unexplained death of Aileen Conway and the disappearance of the three missing girls in the Fort Worth 3 case. The Aileen Conway one, it might not technically be possible to solve this one because we still don't know if her death was foul play or if it might have been an accident or suicide. But it's always been fascinating to me because it's one case where no matter how hard you try to dream up a theory, it's impossible to come up with a theory that makes 100% complete sense because all the pieces of the puzzle just don't fit together. If it was an accident or a suicide, then there's no way we can possibly know what really happened. But if it was murder and you can actually charge someone for this crime, then there is a possibility this case could be solved. The Fort Worth 3 case, that can definitely be solved someday because it involved the disappearance of 3 girls. And as you probably know, there have been a lot of developments in the case this year. I know they did a salvage operation where they looked at the bottom of a lake outside Fort Fort Worth to pull up some sunken cars, which they thought might have a connection to the case. They've pulled up 2 of the cars, and it turned out neither of them had any connection to the case, and they're going to try to pull up the 3rd one this coming spring. I don't know if this lead will go anywhere, but it's getting the case more publicity, which is a good thing, and could potentially lead to answers someday, because this is a case where there are a lot of pieces to the puzzle, but they just don't quite fit together. So I'm hoping that 2019 will be the year when the Fort Worth 3 case is finally solved. Our next question is from Tiffany, and it's, did you attend college? And if so, what is your degree in, and from which university? Has your degree helped with the podcast, or just in your day job? Well, I actually graduated from York University in Toronto in 2001 with an honors degree in humanities, which is a pretty broad category, but that's because my dream was to become a writer. I went to York to take creative writing classes, and I was hoping to become a screenwriter and write movies. So a couple years later, I went to Algonquin College in Ottawa, and I got a postgraduate degree in script writing, where we learned about writing movies, writing TV shows, and even writing for radio. And it's an awesome course, and I want to give a shout out to the professor of that course, Lynn Tarswell, because she's awesome. But I would say that my background in script writing has helped me a lot with the podcast, because every episode I do is thoroughly scripted. Like, every line you see me read is written down. I write full-fledged scripts for every episode that I do, and I'm able to churn them out relatively quickly, and I think my experience in script writing has helped me with sticking to deadlines and also telling stories in a compelling fashion, because even though the podcast covers real-life stories, you still have to tell them in a fashion that keeps the audience interested. Last year, I was actually invited by my professor at the start of the new semester to speak with the new students. She likes to do that, where she'll bring in former graduates to speak to her class on the very first day. And it was quite interesting, because I went in and told them about writing scripts for a successful podcast, even though at the time I took this course, podcasting was not even a thing. But I think if you have an interest in script writing, starting a podcast is a great way to do it, because you don't have to go through levels of executives or anything or get approval to release one. You can just release your own podcast as is, and if you're lucky, maybe a lot of people will hear it someday. So script writing definitely did help me in getting The Trail Went Cold off the ground. Our next question is from Lisa, and it's, how did your collaboration with McGill Foot and Vince Nitro come about? Were you friends before the podcast? And incidentally, she intentionally spelled about A-B-O-O-T, as in a boot, because I'm Canadian, and that's how I pronounce about. And this isn't the only question I received where someone intentionally spelled a word O-O-T, but we'll talk about that in a little later. But anyway, McGillen and I actually became friends when we took the aforementioned script writing class at Algonquin College together in 2004, and we found out that we had a lot of the same interests. We both loved the arts, and we both loved movies, so we stayed friends after the course ended, and a couple of us from the course formed a group together where we would work on projects. We actually have put together quite a few short films, which you can find on YouTube. There's one called Indefinite Late Fee that was written by me, and I have a cameo in it, and McGill edited it, and Vince Nitro did the score, and we put it together for a short film festival, and I won the Best Screenplay Award. So if you want to see the Trail Went Cold crew put together a short film before we did the podcast, just type Indefinite Late Fee into YouTube, because it's posted on there. And there are a couple of other short films we've done together. One called Jet Ranger of Another Tomorrow, which is a recreation of 1940s sci-fi serial like Flash Gordon. And we also did a short film called Full Tilt. So if you type those terms into YouTube, you'll find them. Vince Nitro, he was a longtime friend of McGill's, and as you probably guessed, that's not his real name. His real name is actually Denis, but that's how I wound up meeting him. And of course, since he is such a talented musician, he did the music for a lot of our short films, and then we decided to bring him on to do the creepy music for the podcast. We're the three of us, we do the podcast together, and we're pretty much a well-oiled machine, but we date back many years, so it's great that we've got to the point where we've done a project so successful together. Our next question is from Leslie, and it's, why did you decide to start the podcast? Well, as you might know, for a couple years, I was a freelance writer who published articles on Crack.com and Listverse.com, and the vast majority of the articles I wrote for Listverse were about true crime and unsolved mysteries and cold cases, and it eventually got to the point where I wanted to move to the next level, where for those articles, whenever I wrote about those cases, it was pretty much just a 300, 400 word summary, but I wanted to delve deeper into them. I wanted to really go in depth. So we originally started a project called the Unsolved Mysteries Fanatic, which was going to be a YouTube video series where I actually dressed up like Robert Stack, wearing a trench coat and everything, and stood in front of a blue screen and talked about these cold cases and narrated them and did my own personal analysis. We've actually made the video available to our patrons, our top tier patrons on Patreon, and the very first episode was the Aileen Conway case, which, and if you watch it, you'll see that it's very, very similar to our debut podcast episode. But unfortunately, since we used a lot of footage from the original Unsolved Mystery segment, we put it on YouTube, and we lasted about a half hour or so before we were contacted by Cosgrove Mirror, the company who produced Unsolved Mysteries, because for years they would crack down on anybody who posted footage from their show on YouTube and get it removed. So for the next few years, we tried to find an alternate variation of that project I could do, and we finally reached the point where McGill was moving to Toronto and I was going to remain in Ottawa, so of course it would be very difficult to film any video footage of me since we weren't together in the same city. But then it just hit me, a light bulb went over my head. Why not start a true crime podcast? Because this was only about a year removed from Serial becoming a huge phenomenon, and true crime podcasting was really starting to develop. And I thought, why not try that? Because I could record it in Ottawa, send the audio file to McGill, and he could edit it together and release it. We could still do this project in separate cities. At the time, I had no idea if anybody would want to listen to me talk about these cold cases and narrate them for 30 to 40 minutes, but surprisingly, it turned out people do, and here we are over 130 episodes later, and we're coming up on our third anniversary, so it looks like it turned out pretty well, and I couldn't be happier. Our next question is from Wes, and it's, was The Trail Went Cold always going to be the name of the show, or were there any other brainstormed but ultimately rejected titles? Well, like I just mentioned, we originally started out as a YouTube video series called The Unsolved Mysteries Fanatic, and that was going to be the title of the podcast at first, but we realized we probably shouldn't use the Unsolved Mysteries moniker because we don't want to get any undue attention from Cosgrove Mirror, and we should make an identity of our own. Like, just don't call it Unsolved Mysteries. We should come up with our own unique title. And we really didn't come up with any brainstorming. We just kind of thought for a while, what title should we use? And I think McGill suddenly, it kind of popped into his head. He said, how about The Trail Went Cold? And that's what we decided to go with, and it turned out pretty well because it is a really distinct title that I can work in as a catchphrase in the middle of the episodes that really makes the podcast stick out. So there wasn't really any big story for how we came up with it. It just kind of popped into our heads, but it turned out to be the perfect title for this podcast. Our next question is it was sent in by both Austina and Sophia, and it's, what started your interest in true crime, particularly cold cases? When did you first start getting interested in cold cases? Well, it's not going to shock anybody to hear this, but it all started with the TV show Unsolved Mysteries. I'm old enough that I originally started watching it when it aired during the late 80s. And I was just a kid back then, so I really had a fascination with UFO and ghost stories. And that's what first drew me to the show, because I believe the first episode I ever watched was the one which featured the missing time segment about UFOs. But as time went on, I started to develop less of an interest in the supernatural, and the segments from the show which really stuck with me were the true crime segments, the unsolved cold cases. And I guess I'll use this as a transition, because the next couple of questions I'm going to answer are all related to unsolved mysteries. Our next question is from Amy, and it's: Unsolved Mysteries inspires you and your podcast. What was it about this show that made such a huge impression on you as a kid? Well, pretty much just the overall package, the creepy atmosphere. I still feel that the earliest seasons are the best, where they shot it on grainy film stock and had this documentary style feel. And it's crazy to go back and see just how many people who were involved in the real stories would play themselves in the reenactments. Like, you'd have like family members of murder victims acting out reenactments of pretty much some of the worst moments of their life, like the moments where they found out that their loved one was murdered. And you would never see that today, because as time went on, reenactments, they would always get professional actors. And of course, since I was just a kid at the time, I really didn't have much grasp on the whole concept. So at first I was going, whenever they would show a reenactment of a murder, I'd be like, why wasn't the cameraman do something about this? Why are they just filming? Like, why is this still unsolved if they actually have footage of it? But of course, I finally found out, oh, they're just recreating it with actors. Okay, it's not real. But of course, Unsolved Mysteries would not have been what it was without the late, great Robert Stack. As you might know, he was not slated to be the original host of the program. They did a few episodes for starters where they tried out Raymond Burr and Carl Malden as hosts, but once they got Robert Stack on there, it just clicked instantaneously, because he just had the most amazing voice and the perfect delivery, and he could make any story, no matter how silly it might have been, sound completely creepy. And it was hilarious. I used to think that guy was one of the scariest people alive when I was a kid, but then as I got older and found out what a nice man he was in real life, it's quite crazy just what a contrast his real life persona is to his persona on screen. But yeah, I was just so hooked on there. And I did so many Unsolved Mysteries cases on the podcast, because I found out as I got older that these segments often didn't tell the whole stories. Like, they would leave out a lot of information. So I've always made it a goal of mine that when I cover an Unsolved Mysteries case on the podcast, to give the whole story and reveal the information they never included on the show, to give you a better overall view of the case. Our next question is from Joe, and it's: what is your favorite and least favorite Unsolved Mysteries segment? Well, I pretty much established that one of my favorites was the Aileen Conway segment, not only because the mystery is so baffling, but because it's so well put together. I've always cited that the reenactment of Aileen's husband coming home on the day of the murder and discovering the house in disarray, like the iron left on and the patio door open and the bathtub full of water with the phone off the hook. It's just one of the creepiest things I've ever seen, and I always cite this as my all-time favorite Unsolved Mystery segment, but they did so many great ones, especially during the early years. Another one that really stands out is the segment about the Son of Sam murders, where they explored the possibility that David Berkowitz did not act alone, and that he was a member of a satanic cult, and that some of his other cult members committed some of the murders. As I gotten older, I don't believe now that this is true. I don't believe this satanic cult actually existed. But at the time, as a kid, it was pretty terrifying to me. And I still thought that satanic cults might be real and that they would hold these secret ceremonies where they plotted all these evil murders. But regardless of whether or not you believe the theory, the segment is just so compelling and well produced, and was one of the very first ones I saw. And of course, it played a role in getting me hooked on the true crime stories presented on the show. In regards to least favorite segment, there's one segment that will always make any Unsolved Mysteries fan cringe, and that's the fertility statue segment. During the mid-1990s, Unsolved Mysteries became really oversaturated with stupid supernatural-based stories. Like, they would do episodes with only one true crime story, and then 3 or 4 about ghosts, UFOs, supernatural, or just really stupid human interest stories. And this one was almost the jump the shark moment, because it talks about these fertility statues from Africa, and they brought them into this office in Florida, and apparently if you touch them, they would cause you to become pregnant. And they showed all these stories about these women who had become pregnant after touching these statues. Now, if they had gotten pregnant without having sex after touching these statues, that would be one thing. But the story was, oh my god, I touched these statues, then my husband and I tried to have a baby, and I became pregnant. Oh wow, what a mystery. I don't know how they'll ever solve that one. But it's pretty much considered the low point among Unsolved Mysteries fans. It never should have been made, and it's pretty embarrassing to watch. So yeah, I would definitely cite that as one of my least favorite segments ever produced by the show. Our next question is from Mike Morford from the Criminology Podcast, and it's, what is your favorite Unsolved Mysteries episode or case? I've already talked about my favorite case, but one of my favorite episodes is the very first one you will find if you go onto Amazon Prime. It's not the first Unsolved Mysteries episode ever produced, but it's the very first one hosted by Robert Stack, and it's got 4 cases, and they're all excellent. It starts off with the Dave Davis case. He was a man who murdered his wife and became a wanted fugitive. Then it's followed by the Aileen Conway segment. The one after that is a really interesting historical mystery from the 1920s. A couple named Glenn and Bessie Hyde who went missing while whitewater rafting in the Grand Canyon. And of course the last one is the disappearance of Dottie Kaler, which became immortalized when her husband Jewel Kaler was interviewed and showed no sympathy whatsoever about his wife's disappearance, and pretty much said that life was better now that she was gone. But it's such a great episode, and I guarantee you, if you've never watched the show before and you start watching it on Amazon Prime, this episode will get you hooked. But another great episode from the early years is their 90-minute special about Alcatraz, which I taped off a TV and watched many, many times during my childhood. It detailed the escape from Alcatraz in 1962 by inmates John and Clarence Anglin and Frank Morris, who orchestrated this elaborate escape, but then vanished without a trace, and there's still debate about whether they could have made it and escaped successfully, or if they simply drowned in San Francisco Bay. Not only did it detail the escape, but it also looked at the history of Alcatraz in general, and they even did a simulation where a long-distance swimmer and a couple of rafters went across San Francisco Bay to show if it was physically possible for the convicts to have made it. It's such a well-produced episode, and like I said, I watched it many times as a kid. And even though I developed less interest in the paranormal segments as I got older, I still love the Unsolved Mysteries Halloween special, where they detailed 4 separate ghost stories, such as the haunting of the Queen Mary and the Tallman's Ghost bunk bed segment. Sadly, they don't have this episode on Amazon Prime. They've kind of split up the ghost segments and tacked them on to other episodes. And the Tallman's Ghost segment, which just traumatized me as a kid, it's not even available for viewing on Amazon Prime, sadly. But when I was a kid, even though I found it frightening, I watched that Halloween special over and over. And even if you're a complete skeptic about ghosts, the episode is so well produced that it's still incredibly creepy. Our next question is from Keith, and it's, which Unsolved Mysteries case were you the most happy to see solved? Well, I would technically pick the Golden State Killer. You probably know who that is because he was featured on Unsolved Mysteries during the final season. He was known as the original Night Stalker back then, and I first became familiar with him when I watched the Unsolved Mysteries segment about him. But of course, when the Golden State Killer was identified and captured earlier this year, it was such a huge story. But technically, if you want to talk about a case which was most known from Unsolved Mysteries, and I was really happy to see solved, I would pick the disappearance of Wendy Camp, Lisa Krieger, and Cynthia Brito, because any Unsolved Mysteries fan would probably rank this among the top 5 most infuriating stories ever featured on the show. Wendy was a woman who had suffered from multiple sclerosis, and while she was recuperating in the hospital, her scumbag husband, Chad No, decided to divorce her and was involved in a heated custody battle for their son, Jonathan. And one day, completely out of the blue, Chad phoned up Wendy and asked her if she would like to come visit his family's house to see Jonathan. And Wendy brought along her sister-in-law, Lisa Krieger, and her six-year-old daughter from a previous marriage, Cynthia Brito. But then they never returned, and it seemed so obvious that Chad, his mother Beverly No, and his grandmother Ida were responsible. Beverly and Ida shared a story that they were driving Wendy, Cynthia, and Lisa home, and that Wendy started an argument, and they got so angry that they dropped them off at Walmart somewhere, and that they just vanished without a trace after that. But you had to know that the No family probably murdered them and got rid of their bodies, but since there was no evidence that a crime had been committed, the police really couldn't do anything about them, so it was just so frustrating to watch at the time. But in 2013, I was completely shocked when, right out of the blue, they announced that an arrest had been made in the case because the remains of Wendy, Cynthia, and Lisa were found buried on a piece of property belonging to the No family. The case broke wide open when Beverly's brother confessed they were buried there and led authorities to the remains, and Beverly was subsequently arrested and went to prison. By this point, Ida had already passed away, so they couldn't really do anything about her, and sadly, Chad has still never been charged because even though it seems pretty obvious that at the very least he was complicit in the murders, unless his mother gives him up, there is just no evidence to make an arrest about Chad, so he's probably going to get away with it indefinitely. But I still remember when the story broke and they actually published pictures online in the news articles of the remains of the 3 victims buried in the hole, their skeletal remains. And the one thing that haunted me so much is that you could see their clothing, because Unsolved Mysteries in the reenactments really had an attention to detail, and they actually had the actresses playing Wendy, Cynthia, and Lisa wearing the same clothes they were on the day they disappeared. And then I saw this photograph and I could see their clothing, and it completely matched the clothing they wore in the reenactment. And I just found that so haunting that after all these years of seeing a reenactment of the crime on television, now I was seeing a photo of the real victims and what they were wearing, and it really, really bothered me. But it's a horrible tragedy, but it was just so satisfying that it was finally solved. Okay, our next question is from Andrew, and it's, what did you think of the Dennis Farina reboot of Unsolved Mysteries? And Andrew admitted that he deliberately sent this one in because he knew it would set me off on a rant. In case you're not aware, in 2008 or so, Spike TV decided to do a reboot of Unsolved Mysteries, which was hosted by Dennis Farina. And long story short, I absolutely hated it because it was nothing more than a modernized repackaging of the old Unsolved Mystery segments. It would be one thing if they started the show to present new cold cases and new Unsolved Mysteries, but no, they just took the original segments and they added like flashy graphics and hard rock music and a bunch of fancy editing, and it looked really stupid because they tried to play it off as if these were all recent mysteries, but you look at the original footage from cases from like the late 1980s, and you would see people with 80s fashions like large glasses and mullets and stuff like that, and they were trying to present this as if it was an all-new case in the year 2008, and they really didn't offer anything new at all. I mean, I like Dennis Farina. I think he was a phenomenal actor, but he really didn't get anything to work with because they would pretty much just have him recite Robert Stack's original dialogue. So it was just an unfavorable comparison because as great as Dennis Farina might be, there's no way he's going to compare to Robert Stack. And it just seemed like a significant waste of time. And one thing I always found stupid is that He hosted it in this so-called telecenter where you saw all these people talking on the phones in the background. Yet at the end, Farina would tell you to send in all tips through email through their website. So if there's no Unsolved Mysteries hotline, then who are these people in the background talking to on the phone? What exactly are they doing? It just seemed like a really stupid detail. You can actually watch the Spike TV reboot on YouTube, and they do show a few rare final appeal cases that you can't find on Amazon Prime. So if you're in the mood to watch some cases that you can't find in their original format, I'd recommend watching those, but since you can watch the original version of Unsolved Mysteries on Amazon Prime, there's really no reason to watch this reboot because it was just a colossal waste of time. Our next question is from Wes, and it's, without divulging actual numbers, which types of cases seem to be the most popular and most downloaded? Well, a lot of the Unsolved Mysteries cases I cover wind up becoming some of our most popular episodes. Some of our most popular ones from this year in terms of download numbers included the Circleville Writers case, the Blair Adams case, and the Dottie Kaler case. I remember in early 2017 when they announced that Unsolved Mysteries was going to be on Amazon Prime again and that people could watch the original segments. I briefly asked myself, should I cut back on doing Unsolved Mysteries cases on the podcast now that people can watch the original segments? But no, it actually only increased the demand because people would watch the original segments and ask, can you do an episode on like the Kurt Sova case or the Terry McClure case? And whenever I did, those episodes would get some of our best download numbers. I guess they consider the podcast a nice companion piece where they can watch the Unsolved Mystery segment and then listen to the podcast to get the full story and learn a bunch of new information which was not disclosed on the broadcast. So as long as people keep listening to the episodes we do about Unsolved Mysteries cases, I'll still keep producing them. But I will say that our numbers are generally pretty consistent. There hasn't been one case where I've done an episode and the numbers were so low that I said to myself, I'm never doing anything like that again. So even though some are more popular than others, I'd say we are pretty consistent from week to week in regards to the amount of downloads we get on each episode. Our next question, another one from Mike Morford of the Criminology Podcast. What's the biggest challenge for you in producing a weekly podcast? Well, of course, the biggest challenge is that I actually have a full-time day job, and the podcast is what I do on the side. That's what you'll find with the majority of podcasts out there, is only a handful are ever able to make it to the point where they can do the podcast full-time as their full-time income and not have to do a side job. And I'm not quite at that point yet, but I'm at the point where I have to use a lot of my spare time working on this podcast because I work the regular 40 hours a week at another job. And that's the thing about podcasting, is it takes up so much of your spare time and personal life that you better be passionate about it. Like, you better love what you're doing, because if you don't, and you don't wind up becoming as successful as you'd hoped, then you're going to hate it. I guess what's kind of different to me is that I do not actually have kids. I know a lot of podcasters out there have families and kids, and it can be a really difficult time to balance out a podcast and a full-time job and raising a family. And some people get to the point where they suffer burnout, or they just have to take extended breaks because you have to put your family first. But I'm able to maintain it pretty well just because I really love the subject of unsolved mysteries and cold cases. And one thing I'll say about this, I don't know if it's a good thing, is that there's no shortage of material out there, because I will never run out of cold cases and mysteries to cover on the podcast. That's probably not a good thing for the world in general, that there's so many cold cases out there, but there are just so many that I want to do on the podcast that I'm probably never going to run out of material. Our next question is variations of the same question from listeners Kim and Wes, so I'm going to answer them both at the same time. And they are, how much time do you spend researching each case, and then how long does it take to record the podcast? From case selection to final edit, could you walk us through the weekly process for producing an episode of The Trail Went Cold? I actually don't have any hard numbers about how much time I spend researching each case, because it really all depends on the case. Because if it's a case that, say, I've watched on Unsolved Mysteries dozens of times and I know the case by heart, then my research and writing the script will be done relatively quickly. Whereas if it's a more convoluted case that I wasn't familiar with beforehand, it's probably going to take a lot longer. But the way the process works is that I sit down and then I read from the script and I record it, and then I send it off to McGill to edit it together, and then we add the score from Vince Nitro. Sometimes we use his older themes, but sometimes Vince, he's always working on new music, so sometimes he'll come up with new tracks for us to use. Our episodes kind of have a mixture of new and older tracks, but it's a pretty well-oiled machine because I generally work on it and record it on the weekend, and then I send the rough cut to McGill, and he edits it together, and we try to get it done by Monday night so that we can put it on Patreon early for our patrons, and then release it on Wednesday morning. And we've kept up a long streak going of releasing an episode every week, so it works out pretty well. I think it helps that when I record the rough cut, I still make a lot of flubs and mistakes where I screw up my lines that McGill has to fix, but nowhere near as many as I used to when I first started the podcast, so it's not as much work for him, thankfully. But some of the rough cuts of some of my earlier episodes sounded pretty bad, but it got to the point where we realized we could keep up the workload. We first started the whole thing of doing it bi-weekly every 2 weeks. Then we alternated between full-length episodes and then minisodes. But we're now finally at the point where we could release a full-length episode every week and meet our deadlines all the time. Our next question is from Laura, and she asks, where do you find the time for it? Well, all I can really say is sleep. What's sleep? But I went over the process, and I think I'm kind of lucky in that I have a technical person who can do the editing for me, and that my main thing is mainly only writing and research. And because of my background in script writing, that allows me to write out scripts relatively quickly so that I can maintain the pace of one episode per week. But like I said, you really have to love it if you want to become a podcaster, because it will eat up so much of your spare time. Our next question is from Sonny, and it's, have you ever had a jaw-dropping moment while researching any of the cases? Well, one of the most interesting examples of this took place earlier this year when I did the podcast about the disappearance of Marlena Childress, who went missing in 1987. She was only 4 years old. The main reason I decided to do it is that it aired on Unsolved Mysteries on one occasion, and then it never aired again. But the original segment actually got posted onto YouTube a little while earlier this year, and I watched it, and I'm like, wow, I have to do a Trail Went Cold episode about this case, because this one is a major rabbit hole. As you probably know, Marlena's mother, Pam Bailey, initially confessed to murdering her and disposing of her body, but then she recanted her confession, and they ultimately decided there was not enough evidence to indict her for murder. And the Unsolved Mystery segment focused heavily on an alleged sighting of Marlena, which took place in Memphis the days following her disappearance, where she was in the company of two women inside a hair salon. And when I watched this on the Unsolved Mystery segment, I was thinking to myself, okay, I can see why the mother would be a suspect, but this sighting sounds pretty convincing, and if it was really Marlena, this proves that she was still alive after she disappeared and that her mother could not have killed her. But I was digging in through the newspaper archives, and I suddenly had a big aha moment when I found a few articles published only a few days after the sighting in Memphis, which said, oh, they tracked down this girl believed to be Marlena, and they clarified that it wasn't her. And I'm like, oh, okay. Then why was this on Unsolved Mysteries if they clarified that the girl in the hair salon was not Marlena? But it totally made me look at this case in a different light, because the more I researched, I wound up discovering that most of the evidence which suggested that Marlena had been abducted by a stranger was pretty much debunked, and I came to the conclusion that the only explanation is that her own mother had to be responsible for her disappearance. And if you've listened to the episode, you'll know that Pam Bailey attempted to stab her son 15 years after Marlena went missing, so you could tell she was not a mentally stable individual, and sadly, I think she probably killed her daughter, but unfortunately, they still have not found her remains after all these years, but I hope this case can be solved someday. But that's a segment where, as I was doing the research, I had a bunch of aha moments which made me look at the case in a totally different light. My next question is from Anne, and she asked, have you ever gotten in the middle of researching a case only to discover a fact that has made you go, nope, F it, I'm out? And once again, she spelled out O-O-T, oot, because, my Canadian accent. But yeah, that's a good question. And you might remember I haven't gotten to the point where I've been researching a case and said, no, this is too disturbing. I'm going to stop doing this right now. But I guess the closest example to this is the episode I did a couple months ago about the disappearance of Amanda Gallion, where they looked into the possibility that a child predator named Nathaniel Barjona might have been responsible for her disappearance. I only had kind of a basic knowledge of Barjona before I started researching this podcast. I knew he was the prime suspect in the disappearance of a young boy named Zachary Ramsey, and that it was suspected that Barjona might have actually ate his remains, unfortunately, which is pretty gruesome on its own. But then when I started researching Barjona even further, I concluded that he is one of the most disgusting criminals in human history. I was going to go into more detail on his backstory, but I just went to his Wikipedia page, and there are just so many things there about his background that made me physically ill, man. Like, oh my God, what is the deal with this guy? He's even worse than I imagined. So pretty much on the podcast, all I said is, if you want to learn more about Nathaniel Barjona, all you have to do is read his Wikipedia page, and a couple of listeners have taken that challenge and have told me, oh my God, I went to his Wikipedia page and I was just cringing. This guy is so disgusting, some of the stuff he did to children throughout his life. So I ultimately decided I'm just kind of gonna put a lot of the details about him to the sidelines because I don't want to make people physically sick while listening to the podcast. But I still released the episode, but I kind of did not go into much detail about Nathaniel Barjona because he is truly horrific, and I'm glad he's dead and no longer around because he was an evil human being. My next question, it's actually variations of the same question by two listeners named Laura and Michelle, so I'm going to answer them both right here. What do you do for fun besides being a rad podcaster? What hobbies do you enjoy aside from true crime and podcasting? Well, I'm a major movie fanatic. Like I said, I went to school to take screenwriting because I wanted to be a movie screenwriter, but I just love movies. I have a vast collection of DVDs and Blu-rays and even some old VHS tapes because I used to work for Blockbuster Video as a clerk for about 8 years, and one of the benefits of that is that you would get 10 free rentals a week, so I pretty much watched everything. I still go to the movies a lot. I visit the cinema maybe 40 to 50 times per year because I love watching movies on the big screen. Some of my other interests include watching baseball. I'm a huge baseball fan. I'm also a huge hockey fan, which is to be expected because I'm Canadian. And this might surprise people, but I've also been a lifelong professional wrestling fan. And I will go into more detail about that later on in the podcast because, believe it or not, I got a lot of wrestling questions from listeners, so stay tuned. My next question is from Lisa, and it's, if you have a day job, do your coworkers know about your podcast? Yes, a lot of them do. I work with a lot of people. They think it's a pretty cool idea that I host a podcast, which is pretty popular and successful, but a lot of them aren't really true crime fans or podcast fans. I know it's kind of an uphill battle when I try to tell them what a podcast is, and I use Serial as like a reference point for how popular podcasts can be, and they think I'm talking about a breakfast cereal. They've never heard of Serial, the podcast. I remember when I went to Crime CrimeCon, and I tried to explain the whole concept to them, and I thought I would make it easy by like listing the most famous people who would be at this event, and I told them Nancy Grace was going to be there, and the majority of them didn't even have any idea who Nancy Grace was. But they're supportive, though. They think it's pretty cool, and they're happy that I'm following my passion. There's actually an article out there which was posted on Medium called Government Employee by Day or Public Servant by Day, True Crime Podcaster by Night, which kind of showed how I lived this double life working for the Canadian government and then hosting a podcast. But I will mention one amusing incident which happened where one of my coworkers, I was telling her about the podcast, and she mentioned to me, "Oh yeah, I started listening to True Crime Garage. I think it's pretty cool." And then I pulled out a photo on my phone that I had taken at CrimeCon this past year, where I was in a bar and I was photographed alongside Devin from Thinking Sideways, and then the captain popped up in the background and photobombed us. And she saw, "Oh cool, you got to drink and hang out with the captain from True Crime Garage." And I think that kind of drove home the point that yes, this podcast is legit. I do appear at events. I have a huge fan base, and I get to hang out with other popular podcasters. So yeah, I sometimes have to pinch myself when I talk about stuff like that. But yeah, I'm still at the point where I have to work my day job. But a lot of people, I don't know if any of them listen to the podcast, but they think it's a pretty cool that I have this double life. My next question is from Laura, and it's, did your interest in true crime ever cause you to consider a traditional career related to it, such as law enforcement, litigation, or even forensic science? Well, I have to say, even though I really am into true crime, I never thought of myself going into the field. Like I said, my big desire was to become a screenwriter because I'm more of a creative type of person who loves writing, loves storytelling, and is more into the arts. I really wouldn't get very far if I tried to break into any of those fields. I was pretty terrible at science when I was in high school, and I was just pretty bad at taking tests in general, because one of the best things about going into script writing is that you don't have to do tests and exams, because I find them pretty difficult because I actually have pretty terrible handwriting. So ever since I was in elementary school, whenever I took a test, I would have to make special arrangements to do the exam on a computer, because if I did a handwritten test, you would not be able to read the answers. So that's why I don't see myself ever going into any of those fields. But hosting a true crime podcast is a happy medium between true crime and the more creative arts, I think. Our next question is from Kimberly, and it's, which case was the hardest for you to wrap your head around? Well, that's an easy one. That was the Tommy Ziegler case, which I talked about earlier in the podcast. That's why it's the only two-part episode I've ever done, because the whole thing is so convoluted. It's because of all the contradictions, because the whole story revolves around sightings from eyewitnesses and multiple stories, and they all kind of contradict themselves from time to time. So it was just such a hard time trying to assemble this into a coherent narrative, which is why it wound up being as long as I did. But I'm really happy with how it turned out, and I think that leads us to our next question from Heather, and which podcast episode was your favorite so far? Well, my number one choice is the Tommy Ziegler two-part episode, because of how hard it was to put it together, and I'm really happy that I came up with the idea of exploring the Rashomon effect, where I just present the same events from multiple points of view from Tommy and the two witnesses who testified against them. Because when I first got into this case, I was like, how am I going to convey all this information to the audience in a way that isn't confusing? And then I decided telling the same story from different points of view with different details every time would be the best way to do it. And I think it worked out pretty well, because a lot of people have told me that it's one of their favorite episodes of the podcast. And other favorites of mine include the Circleville Letters case, which was voted on by the fans. I was really proud of that one because it's one of my pet cases. It's just such a bizarre story. But once you put everything together, the whole thing kind of makes strange sense in kind of an odd way. I was able to figure out what likely happened in this story, but it's pretty much a one-of-a-kind mystery. And of course, Tyler from the Minds of Madness podcast was the perfect choice to do a voice cameo as the Circleville writer. He sounded so creepy. Other favorites of mine include the Yuba County 5 case episode. I was really happy with how that one turned out. I love the Cindy James episode, and also the Frederick Valentich episode, which is my first attempt to do one involving UFOs. And I loved the voice cameo from Cambo from True Crime Island as Frederick Valentich during his final radio conversation. I think McGill told me that that's his favorite episode of the podcast that we put together, and it was the perfect one to do for Halloween that year. Our next question is from Kelsey, and it's, have you ever thought about doing another podcast on a specific case that you have done on the show in more detail, or even a case you haven't covered yet, or even another subject you are passionate about? Well, I've been seeing this lately where a lot of established true crime podcasters are doing separate podcasts about individual cases that they have an interest in. I know that Nina from Already Gone has just released one called Don't Talk to Strangers about the Oakland County child killer case, and that Aaron from Generation Y did one called Framed about the disappearance of Brian Carrick. I've thought about that idea. Like, I would really love to do an episode about the Tommy Ziegler case, because even though my two-part episode was pretty detailed, there's just a lot of information I couldn't even cover, and I think you could do an episode that was maybe you could do a podcast which was around 10 episodes long about this case and still not cover all the important details. But it would be difficult because I would have to devote myself full-time to it. I would probably have to quit my job or go on a leave of absence, because that would involve a lot of work. And at this point, I'm not prepared to do it, but maybe in the future, it's something to consider. But I have done another podcast about another subject. Me and McGill did it. We started it in around 2010, and it was called Shouts from the Back Row. And it was me, McGill, and our friend Chris, pretty much just talking about movies and pop culture, because I could talk a lot about that. So we went on as pretty much a side gig for about 7-8 years. And if you search, we're still on iTunes. It's called Shouts from the Back Row if you're interested in hearing me and McGill shoot the shit about movies and stuff. So I have done another podcast about another subject I liked, and it was kind of a good warm-up to doing The Trail Went Cold. Our next question is from Maddie, who just happens to be McGill's sister. Yeah, she's a big fan of the podcast. And it's, have you ever wanted to investigate a cold case yourself? If so, which one? Well, like I mentioned, the Tommy Ziegler case I'm fascinated with, and I would love to do my own investigative podcast about it if I could. But one that I've always wanted to get to the bottom of is the disappearance of Danette and Jeanette Millbrook, which I covered on episode 12 of the podcast. In case you're not familiar with it, it's a pair of African-American twin girls who went missing in 1990, and for 2 decades, the police completely ignored them and refused to even file a missing persons report. But thankfully, the case is now in good hands. You've probably heard of the Fall Line podcast, which did an entire season dedicated to that case and did an excellent job and has given it more attention and exposure than it's ever gotten before. But I would really love to get to the bottom of this one, because there is no evidence, even after all these years, about what might have happened to them. Because if they were abducted, who knows who was responsible? That's what's so frustrating, is that the police have done nothing to investigate this case within the last 2 decades, and I still have no idea why. I wondered, are they covering something up? So I don't know if there's much to work with, but I would really love to see someone investigate this thoroughly and try to figure out the truth about what happened to these 2 girls. Our next question is from Sue, and it's, if you could go back and be a hero and find new evidence to a case and then solve it, what would the case be? What would the evidence be? And why would you pick this particular case? Well, I had to think long and hard about this question, but it's for a case I didn't feature on the main feed of The Trail Went Cold, but I did a bonus Patreon exclusive episode about this one, and that's the Ryan Ferguson case. If you're not aware, Ryan was a young man who spent 9 years in prison for participating in the murder of a newspaper editor named Kent Heitholt. And the main reason he got convicted is because one of his friends, Charles Erickson, confessed that they committed the murder together, but there was virtually no evidence against Ryan. Like, none of the DNA, blood, or physical evidence at the crime scene matched either of them. But because the jury saw a friend admitting that they committed this murder together, they probably thought, why would he lie about that? So Ryan wound up being convicted and got a 40-year sentence for murder. But then the case got picked up by Kathleen Zellner, who I'm sure you're familiar with because she's now representing Stephen Avery and was featured prominently on Making a Murderer 2. And she eventually helped get Ryan's conviction overturned, and he was released from prison in 2013. But unfortunately, because Charles Erickson confessed and took a plea deal, he's still in prison right now, even though most people think he had nothing to do with the murder, and it's technically still unsolved. I have a particular passion for this case because in my early days writing for Listverse, I featured Ryan's case on one of the lists I'd written about wrongful convictions, and Ryan was still in prison at that time, and the Free Ryan Ferguson Facebook page actually found the list and shared it and thanked me for giving attention to his case, which kind of blew me away and kind of made me think I should pursue this true crime thing. It seems to work out pretty well for me, and I think it kind of inspired me to explore true crime further and eventually start a podcast. But what's so particularly frustrating about this case is that they have DNA evidence and they have a promising suspect. It's a guy named Michael Boyd, who was a co-worker of Kent Heitholt's, and the two of them apparently fought all the time and had an argument on the night that Heitholt was murdered. But Boyd, even though there are a number of inconsistencies in his story, the police have never investigated him as a suspect. They've never taken his DNA or any physical evidence, and I feel that if they did some DNA testing on him and checked it against the DNA from the murder scene, they could potentially make a match. But they're refusing to do it. They're still maintaining that they got the right guys all along. And because even though Ryan is out of prison, since Charles is still incarcerated, they're still standing to the story that he had to be the killer, and they got it right the first time. But if I was in charge, I would try to interview Michael Boyd and obtain his DNA and try to match it up with the murder scene. And if it turns out to be a match, charge him with Kent Heitholt's murder. I don't know if anyone in the investigation right now is willing to do that. And if the DNA does not match Boyd, then great. We'll just move on to something else. But it just frustrates me so much that this case seems so solvable, but the Columbia, Missouri Police Department seems reluctant to do it. So I would really love to see full closure to this case someday. Our next question, they didn't provide a name, so I'm just using the front handle of their email address, F150UG. And their question is, favorite type of case? Missing persons, unsolved murder, wrongful conviction, or Jane Doe? I would probably pick missing persons cases as the ones that I'm most fascinated with, because I cannot imagine how nightmarish these must be for the victims' families. With a murder, you at least know what happened to the victim, and you can give them a proper burial and lay them to rest. But for missing persons to not even know what happened to your loved one has just got to be such a traumatic experience. I would be remiss if I did not mention the Charlie Project website. Many years before I started this podcast, I became fascinated by missing persons cases just by reading the profile pages at the Charlie Project. And I can honestly say that if there wasn't a Charlie Project, there might not even be a Trail Went Cold. But there's so many other podcasts out there like The Vanish, which focus exclusively on missing persons cases, that I do a mixture. I do missing persons cases every now and then, and I do more obscure ones, which often didn't get a lot of attention because I know that there are other podcasts which are devoted exclusively to that particular thing. So I kind of mix them up with a unsolved murder or a wrongful conviction or a Doe case. But missing persons cases are definitely the crime that I always have the most fascination with. Our next question is from Lauren, and it's kind of a unique one. What is your favorite household appliance and favorite drink? I never really thought about my favorite household appliance before. I guess I'll go with microwave because when you have a full-time job and you have a podcast, there isn't a lot of time to cook. So a lot of the time I have to microwave stuff. So I'm very grateful that microwaves exist to help me maintain my schedule. So I guess that would be my number one pick. My favorite drink, I guess I'll go with coffee because without coffee, I don't know if I could maintain the energy to keep up the schedule. I guess I'll have to give an obligatory shout out to Tim Hortons coffee because I'm Canadian and it's pretty much a law up here that you have to drink Tim Hortons coffee. So I guess that will be my pick. My next question is, what is your favorite brand of vitamins? Okay, that wasn't actually a real question I received, but we need to take a moment to thank our new sponsor, and I thought that was the perfect segue, so I'll be right back after a quick break. The Trail Went Cold would like to express our thanks to our new sponsor, Care of, as we are very excited that they are supporting our podcast. As I mentioned earlier in this episode, podcasting takes up a lot of my time, and with such a busy schedule to maintain, sometimes you can forget how important it is to take care of yourself. Even when you try to maintain a healthy diet, it can be hard to get all the nutrients your body needs for long-term health. Vitamins can fill in the important gaps that your body is missing from your diet, or give you an extra boost where you need it. 90% of people fall short of FDA-recommended guidelines for at least one vitamin or nutrient. So that's why Care of is very important. Care of's fun online quiz makes it really easy to figure out what vitamins and supplements you specifically need. The short quiz asks you about your diet, health goals, and lifestyle choices, and uses these answers to create personalized vitamin packs just for you. It's very simple. It takes only a few minutes to get your personalized supplement recommendations. Your subscription box includes individually wrapped packets with your specific vitamins and supplements for easy grab and go. You'll receive a 30-day supply shipped right to your door, and it all costs about 20% less when compared to similar brands at local drug and health food stores. As someone who had zero idea what kind of vitamins would be the correct ones for me, I cannot reiterate enough just how straightforward, convenient, and fun this quiz was, and how successfully it matched me up to the perfect supplements. So to get 25% off your first month of personalized Care of vitamins, visit takecareof.com and enter the promo code COLD. That's 25% off your first month of personalized Care of vitamins when you go to takecareof.com and enter COLD at checkout. That's takecareof.com, and the promo code is COLD. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the episode. And we're back. So our next question is from Giselle, and she asks, what cold cases, in general or in particular, would you not cover on the podcast, and why? Well, my number one answer to that would probably be the Maura Murray case, because it is pretty much the most heavily discussed missing persons case of the modern era, and I think a lot of the other true crime podcasters I know would say the same thing. That's not to say I do not find the case interesting, I really do, but it has pretty much been done to death. Like, there was an entire podcast called Missing Maura Murray, which is devoted to the case. So if I covered it on The Trail Went Cold, I really don't think I could add anything new. And the case has become so larger than life that it's become very difficult to separate fact from mistruth because there's just so much information about it out on the internet right now. And I really do want to see it solved someday, but I just wouldn't have much passion talking about it on The Trail Went Cold because I really don't think I could offer anything new. So I really don't see myself covering it on the podcast unless I can think of something totally groundbreaking that no one has ever said about the case before. And I guess my other choice is Eliza Lam, which I think is such a tragedy that because of the internet has become this like spooky, larger than life mystery, when in actuality, it's just a poor woman who had a mental health breakdown and wound up dead under tragic circumstances. But because they showed that surveillance video of her and the hotel operator, and a lot of the editing tried to make it look more spooky and supernatural than it really was, and the fact that she wound up dead in a water tank, a lot of people think there's more to this case than meets the eye, but I really don't think so. I think she just had a breakdown, went into the tank on her own, and died tragically. And I really don't think there's much more to say. I mean, I don't begrudge any true crime podcast for covering it. I know True Crime Garage did it, and it was a really thoughtful exploration into the subject of mental health. And I think that's why this story should be shared for that reason. But I do not think it's a mystery, so I wouldn't spend too much time theorizing and analyzing it. And I really wish people would stop trying to push this as it's some spooky unsolved mystery, because it's a really sad story, so I don't think it would be appropriate for the trail when cold. Our next question is pretty much variations on the same question from both Claire and Tiffany, so I'm going to address them both at the same time. And they're, what makes you not want to include a case on the podcast other than perhaps too little information? And is there a case that you are unable to cover, not from a lack of information, but due to some aspect of the case that makes you uncomfortable covering it? Well, the last one is definitely Eliza Lamb, where I wouldn't want to cover it just and try to present it as some unsolved mystery, because I just think that it's a big tragedy. But you already addressed in the question. One reason I often don't include certain cases on the podcast is even if there's too little information. Those kind of cases usually come in from listeners who know of some unsolved cold case in their hometown or the area that they live in, and they want to get it covered on the podcast. But what's so sad is that there's just so little information, and the cops really don't have any idea what happened. And you look at all the material available, and it would be tough to talk more than 5 minutes about it. I think I have found a healthy solution to that by sometimes including two cases on the same podcast, where if I think there's so little information about the case, I'll just kind of combine it with a similar themed case, and that seems to work out pretty well. But another big reason I don't cover cases on the podcast is if I feel they've been done to death, like Maura Murray. I definitely, as you probably know, I like to focus on more lesser known cases which haven't been covered on other podcasts. And I usually come to the conclusion that if it has been covered on so many podcasts and be discussed to death, I just don't want to do it on the trail when cold. And I'll also avoid cases that have been covered on long-form multi-episode podcasts, which are devoted exclusively to that case. Just as an example, I would be interested in doing an episode about the Tara Calico disappearance, but there's already an extensive long-form podcast about it called Vanish: The Tara Calico Story, which is hosted and produced by one of Tara's childhood friends, and she has access to more information and more details than I ever would. So I just say that if you want to learn more about her case, listen to that one, because I don't think The Trail Went Cold would state anything that hasn't already been covered already. So yeah, that's pretty much my biggest motivating factor for not covering a case on The Trail Went Cold, is if I feel it's been done too much already. So our next question is from Jason, and it's an interesting one. You've said before you won't cover cases that have been done to death. For those of us who are curious on your thoughts, would you be willing to give a one-sentence description of your thinking on these cases? That's a pretty good idea, so I'm going to start on some of the cases he provided me. Number 1, John Benet Ramsey. Well, this may be controversial, but even though a lot of people lean towards the theory that her brother Burke did it, I can't say I'm entirely convinced. It would take too long to go into here, but just the way that Burke was left alone by his parents unsupervised, like immediately following the murder, and the way he was questioned by the authorities initially without a parent present, that kind of leads me to think that if he had killed her, then the parents wouldn't have let Burke out of their sight. So, yeah, I'm not so sure Burke did it. I still go back and forth about whether the parents or an intruder was responsible, but I think the case is just so larger than life that I would be too afraid to tackle it on the podcast. But I don't really subscribe to the Burke did it theory. The next one he provided was Andrew Gosden. That one, sadly, I don't think Andrew is with us. I kind of go back and forth that he either met a predator online who lured him to his death, but I also think it's possible that he just wanted to go on an adventure on his own and was planning to return home, but just by bad chance he crossed paths with someone who did him harm and murdered him. So I really do hope there are answers in that case someday. Next we have Maura Murray, which we've talked about. Ironically, at the time I'm recording this, a blogger just put up a big notice that they thought they had found Maura's body and the internet pretty much exploded, but a lot of people are saying it's not true. So who knows, by the time this episode is released, maybe there'll be a big development, but for now, I really don't know what to think. I just kind of go back and forth 50-50 of her just wandering into the woods and dying of exposure or being picked up by someone who did her harm. But yeah, it just makes my head explode trying to come up with a theory in this case. So yeah, I don't have a definitive conclusion on that one. I'm pretty much 50-50. The next one he asked is Madeleine McCann. I lean towards the parents not being involved. I think they were negligent, leaving her alone in the hotel room, but I kind of think she either wandered off or she wandered off and met with a predator who did her harm, but I don't think the parents murdered her. And the last one is Tamam Shud, the Somerton man. It's kind of interesting. I know there's a lot of rumors that this guy was probably a spy or had like a top secret backstory. But in recent years, we've had a lot of unidentified people like Lori Erica Ruff and Joseph Chandler III get identified. And people always had these elaborate backstories about them, like they were a spy or they escaped from a cult or they were a serial killer. And then the truth turns out to be a lot simpler than they imagined, that they were just ordinary people who decided to change their identities for their own personal reasons. And I kind of have the feeling that's what's going to happen if they identify the Somerton man, that he won't be a spy. He'll just be a guy who possibly had mental problems, and that's why he wound up dead as he did. Though it would be interesting, part of me hopes that they do use DNA testing to conclusively prove that Robin Thompson was his son, because I would love it if the Somerton man had a biological son named Robin. Our next question is from Tony, and she asks, have you personally ever been involved in a crime as a victim or friend relative of the victim? Well, personally, I haven't been involved in one, and I don't know anyone who was a victim of a brutal crime, like a murder, but I do know someone who participated in a murder, and I don't want to go into too many specific details to respect the family's privacy, because the person in question was only 16 years old when the murder happened, and Canada has a law that anyone who commits a murder under the age of 18 does not, because of the Young Offenders Act, does not have their information published in the newspapers, so his name has never been publicly released. But if you're curious about the case I'm referring to, it's the murder of a young boy named Robbie McLennan. It took place in my hometown, a place which not a lot of murders have ever taken place. I won't go into too many details. If you're curious, just Google the name Robbie McLennan, but there were 3 perpetrators, and the person I personally knew, he was under 18 years old, and he pled guilty to second-degree murder, and I think he's been released since then. But I didn't know him too well. He was just kind of a casual acquaintance, but it really shocked me when I found out that he was the unidentified 16-year-old who participated in this murder. It was shook me up quite a bit, but yeah, that's about the closest I've come to knowing someone who was a murderer, and it just changes your outlook when something like that happens, because it's so shocking. Our next question is from Julie, and she asks, do you always attempt to contact the victim's family members before doing an episode about them? And if they either don't want to be on the show or you can't reach them, do you have to get permission to do the show from anyone? Well, I should clarify that true crime podcasters don't need to get permission to cover a case from a family member. If I say that if you want to try and contact them, you probably shouldn't do so unless they kind of have a social media page or a website about the case, because that means they're looking for publicity and they want to get the case out there. But I wouldn't recommend just like looking up their names on Facebook and trying to contact them out of the blue, because that kind of is bad for their privacy, so I wouldn't recommend that. I have been contacted by some family members who've specifically asked me to cover it on the podcast, and I know there are a lot of podcasts out there where that are specifically about the whole premise is interviewing family members who are related to a victim who have suffered a violent crime. The thing with a lot of the cases I cover on The Trail Went Cold is a lot of them are really old or really obscure, so the next of kin for the victims are no longer even alive. Just as an example, earlier this month I did an episode about the unexplained death of Debbie Wolfe, and her mother, her father, and her 3 brothers are no longer with us. So there's no one even to contact to ask permission to use her case on the show. But I have heard from some of the family members of some of the cases, victims I featured on the show, and they're generally very grateful because I exclusively do cases that are unsolved, and they're still looking for answers after all these years. So they still hold on to the hope that the case can be solved someday and that any exposure can help. Okay, our next question is variations of the same question sent by Heather, Mike, and Wes. So I'll address it right here. Have you ever been contacted by someone who you mentioned on the podcast whom you thought was guilty? Have you ever had any scary or creepy incidents where people have called you or emailed you and left harassing, creepy, and threatening messages relating to cases you've covered? Have you ever been contacted by anyone mentioned as a suspect in one of the cases on your podcast? Well, thankfully, no, that hasn't happened yet. I know it has happened to podcasters before where I think it has to do a lot with the fact that some of my cases are really, really cold and happened a long time ago, so it's possible that the suspects are no longer even alive. But I know that some podcasters who have done more recent cold cases sometimes receive threats from people who are likely personally connected to the case. But all that being said, even though I haven't been contacted by a suspect from any of the cases featured on The Trail Went Cold, I did have interaction once with a suspect in an Unsolved Mysteries case. You might be familiar with the Mary Morris murders, about 2 women named Mary Morris who were murdered within 3 days of each other in Houston back in 2001. One of the suspects was a co-worker of the second Mary Morris who had been supposedly harassing her and causing trouble for her at work. And I actually had an email correspondence with them many, many years before I did the podcast. It was because I published an article on my blog about some of my favorite Unsolved Mystery segments, and I put the Mary Morris murders there, and the coworker felt compelled to email me, and our interaction was pretty cordial. He's a unique individual to say the least, but I personally am inclined to think he wasn't involved in the murders. But he's a guy, whenever he sees any mention of the Mary Morris murders, he contacts the people who have wrote about them because he says he really wants to clear his name. I know that on the Unsolved Mysteries message board many years ago, like before I was even a member of that board, they had a massive thread about the Mary Morris case where this guy would get into arguments with relatives and friends from Mary Morris's family, and it got to the point where the Houston PD had to ask the administrators to lock the thread because their arguments were interfering with an open homicide investigation. So there's a lot of passion surrounding that case. I will do an episode about it eventually and have a lot of stories to share, but at the moment at least I haven't been contacted by any murder suspects I've talked about on The Trail Went Cold. But I suppose I should answer this other question that Wes sent me. Would you ever eat a salad prepared by Jewel Kaler, who is obviously the most infamous murder suspect featured on my podcast? And my answer is only if he sent me an 8-page letter detailing how great the salad was. And our next question is from Jessica. Have you ever been contacted by someone involved in a case and learned something new about it? And yes, I have, on a couple of occasions. I can't really disclose any of the new information I heard or any of the cases involved because this is off-the-record stuff, but I have been contacted by people personally connected to the cases who've been able to provide me with information about what they think likely happened. And in a lot of these cases, it sounds like law enforcement does have a good idea about who was responsible, but just lack the evidence to make an arrest. But that makes them all the more appreciative that these cases are featured on this podcast, because there's always a chance for new evidence to turn up or for someone to come forward with information that will allow them to make an arrest. But there are a few cases I've covered where I'm pretty sure I know exactly what happened, but the police just cannot make an arrest to close the case. Our next question is from Sophia, and it's, what do you think is something that contributes to a case becoming cold? Well, sadly, in a lot of cases I've featured on the podcast, you can pin that down to poor police work. And I don't want to give the impression that the podcast is anti-law enforcement, because the majority of the time they do an excellent job. But sadly, the reason a lot of the cases I've featured have gone cold is because of a poor investigation. Either the police lost evidence, or they were corrupt, or they just were indifferent. Because you may have noticed one of the reasons I like to do a lot of older cases on the podcast is just to demonstrate how differently law enforcement handled things back then as compared to now. I've mentioned several times that from the 60s to the early 80s, there was a tendency for law enforcement to write off every missing teenager as a runaway unless there was hard evidence that a murder had taken place. And it's possible that some of these crimes would have been solved at the time, or these missing people would have been found, if law enforcement had taken them a lot more seriously at the beginning. Thankfully, things have changed, and we don't see as many cases these days where missing people are automatically written off as runaways. But sadly, there are a large chunk of cases on my podcast which theoretically could have been solved if they had been handled properly by law enforcement from the very beginning. Our next series of questions are from Tony, and it's, what do you consider the most common mistakes criminals make in murder cases? How would you commit the perfect murder? Well, I don't think, sadly, I have no idea how to commit the perfect murder, and that's probably a good thing, but I think a pretty stupid mistake would be to come up with the perfect murder and then outline how I did it on the podcast. But that's a segue to some of the mistakes criminals often make. Many years ago, I actually co-wrote an article at Cracked about some cases where criminals had gotten away with the perfect crime, but the main reason they were caught was because of their arrogance and narcissism. There's one case from Poland where a guy was murdered and they had no idea who did it. But then an author published a book containing a fictitious murder, which was very similar to this actual murder. I mean, it would be one thing if he read about the case in the newspapers and used it as inspiration. But the problem was that the way the writer described the murder is that he used a lot of details which had not been released publicly. So the police picked up on the fact that there's the only way he could have written this if he was involved in the crime, and he eventually got charged with the murder and convicted. But I feel that's the same thing, that this guy was a narcissist, and I think it was driving him nuts that he had gotten away with the perfect murder and couldn't tell anyone, and so he decided to publish it in a book and kind of make an unofficial confession, but it was pretty much his downfall. And another case I featured in that particular article was about a woman named Stella Nickel, who poisoned her husband by sticking cyanide in his Tylenol. And at first, the police didn't suspect any foul play at all. They thought he died of natural causes, and she got an insurance payout. But the problem was, if it turned out he was murdered, she would have gotten an even bigger insurance payout. So she was pretty much brought down by greed. And the reason Stella wound up being caught is because she got some inspiration from the Chicago Tylenol murders and decided to go into some random drugstores, poison some Tylenols, and after a completely innocent woman bought the Tylenol, took it, and was poisoned, she came forward and said, "Oh my God, this is how my husband died. There must be a mass serial poisoner out there, probably the same person who did the Chicago Tylenol murders. So because my husband was murdered, I should get a bigger insurance payout, right?" Well, the problem with that is that now that there was a mass poisoning scare, the FBI got involved in the investigation, and they were able to eventually conclude that Stella was the person who had done both of these poisonings, and she eventually went to prison for murder. But the fact of the matter is, she had gotten away with the perfect murder, and if she hadn't gotten so greedy, she would have gotten away with it. So I think greed, arrogance, and narcissism and cockiness are a lot of the reasons a lot of these murders get solved, just because the criminal just could not leave well enough alone and keep their mouth shut, and eventually found a way to essentially catch themselves. So now we're going to segue into the subject of professional wrestling. And our next question, pretty much the same question from listeners named Nancy and Paul. And they ask, I know you were a huge wrestling fan. Who were some of your favorites? Any interesting stories to share? Favorite professional wrestler, living or dead? Well, I started watching wrestling in 1987, and my favorite growing up was Ricky the Dragon Steamboat. I was a big fan of Hulk Hogan back then, though as I got older, I eventually got sick of him. But one of my favorites of the modern era are Edge and Christian because they happen to hail from my hometown of Orangeville, Ontario, Canada. They went to my same high school, even though they were several years older than me, so I didn't actually share the high school with them. But I wound up meeting both of them, ironically enough, when I was working in the Blockbuster Video in Orangeville, and they just happened to come home to visit and rent some movies from me, so it was pretty cool. And I follow both of their careers, and they both did very well for themselves. They're both retired right now. Some of my other favorites, my favorite of the modern era is probably Daniel Bryan. I've been following him since he wrestled in Ring of Honor like 15 years ago, so I've been rooting for him ever since, and I'm glad he's an active wrestler again. But I do have a lot of interesting wrestling stories. I've been to a lot of events. I'm actually going to Phoenix to see the Royal Rumble at Chase Field next month, and I've attended 3 WrestleManias. I went to WrestleMania 6 in Toronto and saw Hulk Hogan versus The Ultimate Warrior. I went to WrestleMania 18 to see Hulk Hogan versus The Rock, and I went to WrestleMania 23 in Detroit, where none other than Donald Trump shaved Vince McMahon's head and received a Stone Cold Stunner. I have no idea what happened to him after that. I should go look that up. I'm pretty curious. So I guess we'll segue into my next question by talking about a wrestler who used to be one of my personal favorites, and that's Chris Benoit. The question here is from Damien, who asks, being that you are a wrestling fan, would you consider covering the Chris Benoit murder-suicide? Well, I don't know if I would cover it on The Trail Went Cold because it's technically not an unsolved crime, but this is one case where the big mystery is not the who did it, but why they did it. If you're not familiar with this story, Chris Benoit was a veteran professional wrestler who murdered his wife Nancy and his 7-year-old son Daniel at their home in Atlanta in June of 2007. And prior to the event, I was a huge Chris Benoit fan. Like, he was considered pretty much the best technical wrestler in the world. And he had quite an underdog story where for years he was kind of held down. He didn't get his just due because he was a smaller guy and he wasn't the most charismatic guy. But then at WrestleMania 20, he finally won the world title in the main event and got his big shining moment as a reward for all these years of hard work. And I never thought that it was one of my favorite moments as a wrestling fan, and I never thought that 3 years later he would become a murderer. But what had happened is he was booked to wrestle a match on a World Wrestling Entertainment pay-per-view the night before, but the match was canceled because he had to fly home because of a family emergency. And then the following day, they announced that he and Nancy and his son Daniel had all been found dead in their home. And what's pretty crazy is at the time I learned this news, the thought of it being a murder-suicide never crossed my mind because Benoit was known as this professional gentleman, as far as I had heard, a class act, and I just cannot picture him murdering his own child and his wife before killing himself. And I think the WWE didn't think so as well because later that night they played a tribute show to him, and then only halfway through the show was it officially announced that this was a murder-suicide and that he had killed his wife and son, and it was pretty devastating to me because I had been such a fan of his, and I questioned to myself whether I wanted to watch professional wrestling ever again. And of course, after it happened, one of the big stories was that, it was roid rage, that steroids had made him do it. But now, because of research into his brain, we realize that this might have been the result of CTE and that he was not in his right mind when he committed these murders. Because when you look back at his career, he was a guy who did so many high-risk moves. He would do a flying headbutt from the top rope in virtually every single match. And you do that for 15, 20 years every night, and it's going to damage your brain in a serious way. But it's always going to be a big mystery about, did the CTE damage his brain and cause him to become a murderer? Or was he always a bad human being all along and it was buried deep beneath the surface? I know that after the death, it came out that Nancy had once filed a domestic abuse charge against him years earlier, though she eventually withdrew it. And stories started to come out about some of his weird behavior, how he would bully and harass some of the other wrestlers backstage. So you kind of started feeling that even though his public image was that he was kind of a class act, that maybe he was a bad guy all along. Like even his best friends, like wrestler Chris Jericho, who said, "The Chris Benoit who murdered his family is not the same Chris Benoit I knew," have shared stories that make you wonder if this guy was right in the head, that if there was something really dark beneath the surface. I don't think we'll ever know the truth, but this is definitely an example of a crime that bothered me more than any other that I can remember, just because you gotta hate it when a guy that you idolize and you consider to be a hero turns out to be a monster. So it was a big turning point to me. I don't know if I'll cover him on The Trail Went Cold, but this is one crime where I could talk about it for a long, long time because it deeply affected me. But if there's any consolation, at least now in professional wrestling, they have better concussion testing and it's not as high risk, and they try to stop guys from damaging their brains as much as Benoit did, in hopes that stuff like this will not happen again. Our next question is from Mike, and he asks, would you ever cover the Boys on the Tracks case on your podcast? That's definitely one I want to cover, but I'd have to be in the right frame of mind to do it because it is one of the biggest rabbit holes out there. If you're not aware of it, it was featured on Unsolved Mysteries. It was about the murders of two teenage boys, Kevin Ives and Don Henry, who were found on a train track in August of 1987 in Arkansas. And I first became familiar with it when I saw the Unsolved Mysteries segment, and it scared the bejesus out of me. Just the whole atmosphere of these two boys walking into the woods in the middle of the dark and eventually being murdered. And one of the leads in the case was this mysterious man in military fatigues who had been seen walking around the area that night. And nearly like a week earlier, he had fired on a police car. And the reenactment with this man in the military fatigues actually gave me nightmares when I was a kid. I found this story absolutely terrifying. The reason I've held off on it is because it has been covered on a number of other podcasts. Insight did it, and of course True Crime Garage did like a 4-part series, which was pretty elaborate, and I didn't want to release a podcast episode about it so soon after they had released it. But because Bill Clinton was governor of Arkansas when this takes place, there are a lot of conspiracy theories surrounding the Clintons. So when researching this, it would be a challenge to try to separate fact from fiction from conspiracy theories. So one of these days, I'll take a lot of time to try to delve into this and make an episode about it. But it would be a difficult, daunting task because the case is just such a large, monstrous rabbit hole. Though, since we were just talking about pro wrestling, I'll just say one thing. Earlier this year, you may have read about a former professional wrestler named Billy Jack Haynes who came forward and claimed that he was present when these murders took place and had information about who did it. And his story actually ran in the Arkansas media. But as someone who's followed wrestling for a long time, all I can say is, do not listen to anything this guy says. Even in the crazy world of pro wrestling, Billy Jack Haynes is a lunatic, and I do not believe for 1 second that he was present when these murders took place. He was still an active wrestler for the WWF in 1987, traveling and wrestling 300 days a year, so I seriously doubt he became involved in drug smuggling and a government conspiracy involving the murders of these two boys. So if you read about Billy Jack Haynes saying that he solved the mystery, don't buy it. Our next question is from Jessica, and it's, is there any case that really got to you on an emotional level, or are you able to look at the cases on a strictly professional level and not get emotionally invested at all? Most of the time I can look at them on a professional level, but I do realize that if I had a person go missing in my personal life or someone I cared about was murdered, I would probably be an emotional wreck. There's a far difference between investigating true crime as like a passion and a hobby to actually being close to someone who suffers like this. So that's kind of my main goal when I do these podcasts, is to have empathy for the victim and the families of the victims, because it's a personal hell for them. I think a recent one that really got to me was the disappearance of Michael Donaghy, who was a 5-year-old boy who went missing from British Columbia in the early 90s. And I've seen the pain that the parents have gone through, because all they did was turn away from him for about a minute or so in a public place, a crowded parking lot, and he wound up going missing. So he was likely abducted by someone who got really, really lucky. And I mean, this was one case I covered where I could not fault the police investigation at all. Like, once they found out he went missing, they did everything possible to try to track him down, and they had very little evidence to work with, but they did their best. And for some reason, whoever took Michael just slipped through the cracks, and you can't really fault anybody at all who investigated this case, and you can't fault the parents. So I cannot imagine how painful this must be to lose a child under these circumstances. So yeah, sometimes these cases can be rough, but I try to keep them on a professional level and not let them tear me apart, because they're pretty horrible stories. Our next question is from Kimberly, and she asked, do you dream about these cases? And yes, sometimes I do. Strangely enough, I don't know if that's common for podcasters to dream about crimes that they're researching, but it has happened to me on occasion. One of a recent example is a Patreon bonus episode I did about the Jeffrey McDonald case, and while I was working on it, I had a really weird dream where those hippies that supposedly murdered his family came into my bedroom and started attacking me while saying, "Acid is groovy, kill the pigs." And it's kind of ironic because I don't think that event actually happened. I think McDonald's story is a load of bunk and that those hippies never existed. But I guess I got so wrapped up on the case while I was working on it that I started having a dream about those weird hippies, which kind of shook me up a little bit. But yeah, I guess it's just a side effect of the job if you start dreaming about the true crime cases you work on. Our next question is from F150UG. Besides yours, what is your favorite podcast? Well, it's really hard to pick just one because there's so many of them I love. I guess I'll just pick my most influential. Obviously, Serial Season 1, which pretty much started the true crime podcast boom. It inspired a lot of people who wanted to become a podcaster of their own and get into podcasting themselves. Another early one I listened to, which heavily inspired me, was the Generation Y podcast, which is still one of my favorites. And what's incredible is that they started this years ago before there were true crime podcasts. So they were doing it before it was cool. And they're pretty much the standard you have to measure yourself to because they do such a great job. And I was so happy to finally meet Aaron and Justin in CrimeCon. And they're such great human beings. They're so nice and very supportive of their fellow podcasters. And it's great to still be able to communicate with them on social media from time to time. Podcasting is one where you can meet some of your inspirations and they turn out to be as great as you hope to be. Another example is the Thinking Sideways crew, who I was big fans of before I broke into podcasting, and I got to hang out with them a lot at CrimeCon, and we've even done cameos on each other's shows, so they've become good friends of mine, and I'm sad that their podcast is now over. Another great podcast I listened to recently was In the Dark Season 2. Season 1 was excellent, but Season 2 I felt was on another level because they were looking at the death penalty case of Curtis Flowers, who was on death row for the murders of 4 people at a furniture store in 1996. And what's crazy is that he's gone on trial 6 times for the same crime, and a lot of these convictions have been overturned because of prosecutorial misconduct, yet the same prosecutor who did this misconduct had been allowed to try him at the future trials, and you can tell that racism played a role in this conviction and that Curtis Flowers is probably innocent, and this podcast made such a huge impression that the case is now going to be heard in front of the United States Supreme Court. So hopefully they will get to the bottom of this, but I found Season 2 of In the Dark to just be so riveting and shocking at the same time. Our next question is from Brendan. What true crime podcasts are your least favorite? Well, I'm not going to single anybody out or name any names. I get along very well with most of the true crime podcasters out there. But I will say that the one thing that turns me off from podcasts, which you should never ever do, is victim blaming. If you do an episode where you just blame the victim for the crime that they suffered, you are going to turn a lot of people off, and that is just a major no-no. You should always show empathy and compassion for them, no matter what choices they made. Our next question is from Mike, and he asks, you did a great job on the podcast Let's Talk About Sex on their episodes regarding Outreach International, where you portrayed a Canadian citizen who got caught up with a cult. Did you enjoy doing that? Would you ever consider doing something like that again? Well, I have actually done voice cameos on a couple of podcasts, and the person who actually recommended me for the Let's Talk About Sex gig was my friend Christy Lee from the Canadian True Crime podcast, because earlier this year she asked me to lend my voice to her episodes about the Canadian serial killer Robert Pickton, because she wanted to do a reenactment of a jailhouse conversation Pickton had with an undercover police officer, and since I had a Canadian accent, she thought I would be perfect for the job of playing a despicable serial killer. So so I have done voice work on other podcasts, and I love doing it. It's fairly common for podcasters to do voice cameos on each other's shows. Like I mentioned earlier, I got Tyler from the Minds of Madness podcast to do the voice of the Circleville writer, and I got Cambo from True Crime Island to voice Frederick Valentich. And if anyone asks me to lend their voice to their own podcast, I would be happy to do it, because that it's much more fun to hear someone acting the scene out rather than just listening to the host read a transcript of the actual event. So I would definitely consider doing something like that again in a heartbeat. Our next question is from Saber. Any advice for someone who enjoys reading a script, reading aloud, but has no interest or skills in the information gathering and deduction part? That's a really interesting question, because a lot of true crime podcasters actually have their own research and writing team. I know the most famous example of this is the Case File podcast, where the anonymous host reads all the details about the story, but he has an entire team of researchers and writers helping him out. That's not to say that you can do this right from the outset, because Case File is a hugely successful podcast where he can pay people to do this, but if you're just starting out on your own, you probably can't afford to hire researchers and writers, but you could always get a friend of yours to help you with the researching part. I know a lot of podcasters who do that, where if they have a very tight schedule with their family or their day jobs, they get other people to help them out with the research and the writing, and it works out pretty well. So if you're not interested in doing that yourself, but you want to host your own podcast, you can always get a friend of yours to help you with the research. And the deduction part, that's kind of a thing that I do on my podcast, but you don't necessarily have to do that on your own podcast. I know that I analyze unsolved mysteries and come up with theories about what I think happened, but there are a lot of true crime podcasts that don't do that. They just tell the story and they share the facts about the case, or they only cover solved cases where there's a story from A to Z and they don't have to analyze an unsolved crime. So if you don't think you have good deduction skills, you don't have to do a case which involves deduction. So don't let that discourage you. If you're nervous about certain aspects of starting a podcast, still go for it and just put your feet in the water and see how you do. And if there are some aspects of the production that you're not great at, then see if you can find someone else to help you, because a lot of successful podcasts do that and it works pretty well for them. Our next question is from Stina, who asks, who is your favorite serial killer and why? Well, I'm not sure I'd use the word favorite, because all serial killers are horrible, horrible human beings. Except for Dexter Morgan, I guess he's kind of okay. But I guess I'll rephrase that and ask, what is the serial killer I found the most interesting? And I'd probably go with the Golden State Killer, because I studied his case for many, many years, because it just blew my mind that he had gotten away with all these crimes and that they really didn't seem to have a good idea about who this guy is. And I feared that it would probably never be solved and that he was probably long dead from many years ago. So it was just such a huge event earlier this year when they announced that they had identified him as Joseph James DeAngelo and arrested him. And it's just so satisfying to put a face to that monster and know that he, no matter what happens, he's going to remain locked up for the remainder of his life, that he came close enough to getting away with it, but now the whole world knows who he is. But I can definitely, for years, I was just kind of obsessive over this case, just trying to figure out how one man could get away with all these. But now that we know what he looks like, we know he's just a man, and that eventually your crimes will come back to bite you. Our next question is from Stephanie. When you go on vacation to an area where a famous crime is committed, do you visit the site? Well, I haven't really been to that many places which have had famous crimes, so I haven't really done this before. I was in Nashville for CrimeCon for a couple days before the event, but there aren't that many really famous crimes that I could think of offhand from Nashville that I could have gone to visit. When I went to New Orleans in the summer, we were considering the possibility of taking a true crime tour and actually visiting some of the locations of the murders from the New Orleans axe murderer from 1919. But it didn't work itself out. But when going back to CrimeCon in New Orleans next year, I'm hoping that maybe if I have time, I might be able to visit some of those sites, because I took a ghost tour while I was down there in New Orleans, and that was pretty fascinating by itself. It's such an interesting place, but there are so many places there that I didn't get a chance to visit that I would like to see. Another question is from Rebecca. Have you ever or would you consider writing a book about either true crime, another subject entirely, or even fiction? Well, I haven't really written any books. Over the years, I've written a lot of screenplays because I was so into screenwriting. I haven't gotten anything produced, but I did enter quite a few screenwriting competitions over the years and made it to the semifinals and finals of a couple of them. So I would love to get a screenplay published someday. I don't know about writing a book. I'm one of those people who likes writing like the dialogue and the facts of the story, but I don't like going into details about the surroundings and the scenes. So that's why I've never attempted to write a novel. But writing a book about true crime could potentially be an interesting adventure. I've thought about the idea of writing something on one of the stories featured on The Trail Went Cold and going into more detail. So the door's always open. It could be a possibility, but I can't say for sure. Our next question is from Mike, and it's, do you have any other ideas that you will be implementing for future bonus Patreon episodes? Yeah, I've been experimenting quite a bit. I think that with our bonus episodes on Patreon, we can try things that are a little different from the norm. Just earlier this month, I released one called The Trail Went Hot, where I looked over a lot of the cold cases that were solved in 2018. Something I'm possibly going to experiment with in the future is doing my own commentary track over Unsolved Mysteries episodes. What I'll do is watch the episode, give my observations or additional details, and record it onto an audio track, and then you can load up the episodes on Amazon Prime and play my commentary track over the episode itself in sync. It's kind of like the Mystery Science Theater riff tracks, where they would do their own commentaries over hit blockbuster movies, and then you would play the commentaries over the movies while you watch them. I'm a big fan of Mystery Science Theater, in case you hadn't figured it out already, so I might be doing that in the future. And another question you asked, that being said, would you ever consider covering the final appeal of Larry Race? As you've seen on Patreon, I've done some of the final appeal episodes from Unsolved Mysteries where technically the person served time in prison for the crime and was released, but it's still unclear if they were innocent or guilty. And I definitely plan to do something about Larry Race because it's a controversial one where he was convicted of murder but maintained that his wife's death was nothing more than an accident. And he eventually got paroled but still never admitted to the crime. So I would love to discuss about the possibility if he was actually guilty or not. So you can look for a bonus episode about his case on Patreon sometime later this year. Our next question is from Sonny. Have you changed your mind about what may have happened to the victims on any of your past podcasts since publishing them? Well, I can't say there are any cases where I've done a complete 180 and decided to myself that the theory I presented on the episode is 100% wrong now, but there are a few where I've looked at it from a different light. A prime example of this, I think, would be the mini-sode I released last year about the murder of Sarah Fox. If you heard that episode, you're probably familiar with a guy named Dimitri Scheinman who inserted himself into the investigation and became the prime suspect and started causing confusion by saying, even after he left the country, he was telling law enforcement that I am visited by the ghost of Sarah and she's in love with me and wants me to solve her murder. And the way the guy acted, like when I recorded the podcast, I kept thinking he has to be the killer. Like there's no hard evidence against him, but he's awfully suspicious. But surprisingly, once I released the episode, I think the responses were about 50-50 from listeners about whether they thought Scheinman was the killer or not. Some people thought that it's possible that someone else may have killed her, but Shyman stumbled across Sarah's body in the woods before she was discovered and developed an unhealthy obsession with her, even if he didn't actually kill her, because he's a complete lunatic and he deserves no sympathy, even if he's innocent, because he has brought on a lot of the trouble himself by inserting himself into the investigation and sharing these ridiculous stories about communicating with Sarah's spirit. But I have looked more into the possibility that maybe he wasn't the actual killer. Maybe he was just a guy yearning for attention who has pretty much ruined the investigation this way, but it's possible that someone else committed the crime. So I'm more 50-50 now on Dmitry Shyman than I was at the time I recorded the podcast. So hopefully this case can be solved someday. And here's another question from F150UG. Besides the Pam Butler case, what other of the cases you've covered have there been major developments in? Well, at the time he sent this in, I think it was before it was officially announced that the murder of Jodine Sarin had been solved, which, as you recall, I covered on an episode of the podcast in February. Even though the killer, David Mabrito, was dead, they were able to use genetic genealogy to match the DNA evidence to him and conclusively link him to the crime. But of course, he can't be charged for it now that he's dead. So I was very happy to see that one solved because it was one of the more disturbing, heinous crimes I featured on the podcast, and it was good for her parents to finally find out what the killer was, because they stared him face to face at the time and didn't even know that he was the killer. So it's good to know that they finally received closure. Another one that I featured on the podcast, which has been solved, which is easy to forget because it wasn't the main subject of the episode, is the identification of the Huntington Beach Jane Doe from 1990. I talked about it on my mini-sode about Jonelle Matthews when I explored the possibility that Jonelle might have been the Jane Doe. But sometime in 2017, they conclusively identified the victim as a woman named Andrea Kuiper. So we know it wasn't Jonelle, but it was good to solve a case that I talked about on the podcast, even though it wasn't the main subject of the podcast. So I'm only hoping that there's a lot more to come in the near future. I guess when it comes to developments, I mentioned earlier that they were searching at the bottom of a lake in the Fort Worth 3 case this past September and October to pull up some cars that they thought might be connected to the case. I don't know if this lead is going to go anywhere, but it would be great if the Fort Worth 3 case wound up being solved sometime in the near future. And our next question is from Kathy. Which long-time unsolved cases do you think will be solved in 2019? Well, one case which I featured on the podcast that I think has the best chance of being solved is the Orange Socks case, the murder of the unidentified Jane Doe in 1979, who is only known as Orange Socks. And it was kind of a crazy coincidence because literally a few days before my episode about it was released, they published an article saying that they've reopened the case and are exploring DNA evidence. And apparently the DNA Doe Project is looking into taking on the Orange Socks case, which is incredible because they've solved so many high-profile cases in 2018 involving unidentified Jane and John Does, such as Lyle Stevick and Joseph Newton Chandler III. So if they take on the Orange Socks case, I think there's a good chance she'll be identified sometime in 2019. And one case that I think could be solvable is the Holly Staker murder, which I covered on the podcast last year, because they have DNA evidence that exonerated Juan Rivera and proved that he wasn't the real killer. And they found DNA evidence at the murder of a man named Delwyn Foxworth, which took place in 2000 while Rivera was behind bars. So we know this guy is responsible for at least 2 murders, and they have his DNA. So if they decide to upload it to a genealogy website, I'm hoping that they do this, but I know that the Holly Staker murder is such an embarrassment overall for the state of Illinois because of all the corruption that they may not have an interest in solving it. But I think out of all the cases I've covered on The Trail Went Cold, this is one of the most solvable because they have the DNA right there. So I hope this guy is arrested sometime in the future. My next question is from Andrew. What's your favorite thing about being a podcaster? Well, I'd say that one of the best things is that it's opened so many doors for me and introduced me to so many new people, some of whom have become friends of mine. If you've got an interest in true crime, I'm sure you can attest to the fact that it's typical to live a life where no one in your personal life shares your interest in true crime and thinks you're kind of an oddball for being obsessed with it. But so the best way to deal with that is to go online and talk on message boards and in forums with other true crime fanatics. Well, I'm kind of the same way, where there's very few people in my personal life who share my interest in true crime, but starting a podcast has opened me up to all these people. I've made so many friends who share my passion, who are not just fellow podcasters, but listeners as well. Like, I have my own Trail Went Cold discussion group where I can just start discussions and my listeners will chime in and we can talk about certain cases, which is something that would probably never happen in my personal life. But it's just so humbling, the fact that I've been to CrimeCon in 2 consecutive years. I did a show in Toronto that I participated in, and I also had a meetup in New Orleans where I got to meet some Trail Went Cold fans, and just the fact that people are excited to meet me and tell me just how much they love the show and what big fans they are, and it's just so humbling. It's just to know that you're doing something and that you're doing like a project that does some good in the world. Like, I'm not deluding myself into thinking that I'm single-handedly going to solve any cases, but the fact that a lot of these cold cases are getting some public attention, it opens up the idea that these cases are not forgotten about and could potentially be solved in the future. And that's just very gratifying to me. So yeah, becoming a true crime podcaster has definitely changed my life, and all for the better, because the world is a completely different place for me in 2018 now than it was at the end of 2015, right before I started the podcast. And my final question is from Mike Morford, once again, of the Criminology Podcast. And I saved this one for the last because it is the most important question I received, and I know that all of you there are itching to hear my answer to it. Do you believe in Bigfoot? And I think this question came about because I did that recent episode about the Trenny Gibson disappearance, where I tried to dispel all the rumors that Bigfoot was responsible for her disappearance. But when I was a kid, I definitely had a fascination with Bigfoot. I was a big fan of the movie Harry and the Hendersons, and I remember Unsolved Mysteries reading in the TV guide that they were going to do a segment about Bigfoot on one of the earliest episodes, and I got so excited. And it was a story about sightings of Bigfoot in a town in Colorado, and of course, because I was kind of a Bigfoot fanatic at the time, I thought it was their coolest segment ever. But ironically, I hadn't seen that in about 30 years because it was one of their lost segments, I think. And when they uploaded it to Amazon Prime, I finally got to watch it again. And it struck me, this is pretty stupid. So needless to say, I think that if Bigfoot existed, they would have found some sort of clear-cut evidence by now that he was real. So I'm not as much of a believer as I was when I was 9 years old. But I still find Bigfoot to be an interesting subject. And every now and then, I will watch Harry and the Hendersons. It's still on Netflix, so it's still pretty fun to watch. Anyway, that about brings an end to our Q&A episode, and wow, we're creeping up on the 2-hour mark right now for this episode. I never thought I would do an episode this long, but I received a lot more questions than I expected. So a big thanks to everyone who sent in a question, as it's still humbling to me that so many people would be interested in hearing me talk and ramble on about this stuff. But 2018 was a great year for the Trail Went Cold, and we're going to be reaching our 3-year anniversary in February, which is just incredible to believe. I'm sure 2019 is going to be another amazing year, as I'm going to be doing more live events and live appearances, and I hope to get the opportunity to meet many more of you listeners. But as you've heard from this episode, I do this podcast and work so hard on it because I love it, and I love creating content for you folks, and I greatly appreciate your support. So all that's left to say is have yourself a happy new year, and join me next Wednesday for 2019's first new episode of The Trail Went Cold.